Welcome to another dietitian-led webinar talking about our GLP-1 medications and how they may be affecting us and ways that we can look at our nutrition to help us maximize those benefits while we're using those GLP-1 medications. This week's topic is one that I find very, very interesting, and I'll do my best not to get into the weeds. But it's titled Metabolic Mayhem, How Long-Term Undereating Can Affect Your Metabolism. So I'll do my best to touch on the high points, not get too deep into the weeds, but it is a really interesting topic that I hope you enjoy. As always, there will be time at the end of the session to submit any questions you may have, so feel free to touch the bottom left-hand button on your screen about Q&A if you have any questions for me, and you can choose to be anonymous or have your name, and feel free to type in your questions about this or any other nutrition related topic that may come to mind. Without further ado, let's get started. As always, every week I like to say, remember, it's the quality of your calories that matters. And again, like most weeks, I think you'll be able to see how that factors in to this particular topic as we go along. So what we're going to cover, certainly the basics of metabolism. So I'll do a very surface level definition to get us started. We'll also talk about what influences our metabolism, since there are many factors. I also will talk about how we can compare, or what do we mean by calorie deficit versus undereating, since there is a difference. And I will talk about what those negative impacts could be if you are undereating versus simply just following a calorie deficit. And finally, we'll just touch on the strategies to maintain your metabolism while losing weight. And hopefully you'll leave with some new information and some knowledge. And as always, I'm open to any questions because this is an area that is still being studied actively. So let's talk about metabolism. One definition I saw that keeps it very simple, but basically touches the high points that I wanted it to, is your metabolism is how your body uses energy for everything your body does. And I think that's really good. It puts it basic up front, and that's the definition we're really looking for right now. And to further define, because I think sometimes the term energy can get a bit confusing because we think energy up, moving, active. But really, energy in this context is the calories from what you eat and drink. So the foods that we eat and drink, if they have calories, that means they have energy that our body can then use to burn and fuel it for its functions. And our metabolism is influenced by multiple factors, and I've just scratched the surface on here, but our age, our sex, those influence it a bit. Body mass, so our general weight, also has quite a bit of influence. Genetics, ethnicity, physical activity, of course, as people will mention frequently. Also, hormones can play a part. But interestingly, and I guess promisingly, fat-free mass has the largest amount of influence on our metabolism, because there are some things we are simply born with that we don't really have a whole lot of control over, but in some part we do have some control over our fat-free mass. So it's nice to know that that can play a big factor there. So let's talk about how these calories that we burn, I want to be very clear about that, how those are used. And so what I mean by that we burn, because we may eat more calories than we burn, right? Which is when people start to see weight gain, or we may eat fewer calories than we burn, which is usually when people are trying to lose weight. There is that, like I said, calorie deficit. And when you have that calorie deficit, if your body requires 2,000 calories to function and you're eating 1,500, then that extra 500 calories will be coming mostly from fat mass. So that's our stored energy in our body, and also a little bit of muscle. So the calories that we're burning, how do those get used throughout the day? First and foremost, RMR, or you may also see it called BMR. They're basically interchangeable. And that means resting metabolic rate. And that is the energy used for, as I tell a lot of people, simply existing. So your breathing, your brain function, muscle building, maintenance, repair of your body, all these functions that we don't really think about takes up the biggest chunk of our total daily energy expenditure. So that sometimes surprises quite a few people because that's even when we're sleeping, we're burning calories. And this is where the biggest part of our calorie burn comes from. And for some people, I should just at least mention, it's not always 70%, but this is essentially an average. Now, the more variable area of where our calories get spent is the activity energy. And this isn't an area that we have a lot of control over, but it's also one of the smallest parts. And I think a lot of people feel like they take up a huge amount of calories, but really ultimately not so much. In fact, our exercise activity for the average person is somewhere around 5%. Athletes, it is definitely higher. And depending on what level of exercise you're getting, it can be higher, maybe 10%, maybe 15% if we're being very, very active. But surprisingly, it is one of the smallest chunks. And that's one reason why you may hear the phrase, you can't outrun your fork. And part of that is our exercise is not going to take up all the calories that we may eat sometimes. Interestingly, some people find this fascinating. I remember I did the first time I learned it. Non-exercise activity. So again, that's part of our activity energy. And you may also hear people call this NEAT, so non-exercise activity thermogenesis. That takes up maybe 15% of those calories, and that includes fidgeting, moving around the house. So when we're wakeful and doing something, but not necessarily physically exercising and having that moving with a mission, if you will. And then finally, TEF, or thermic effective food. That's the energy that your body needs to use for digesting, absorbing, and using the nutrients from the food you eat. So yes, there is a calorie cost to eating. And people want to ask, well, what spends the most calories? And it is protein. So protein does require a little more effort on our body's behalf to digest it and process it. And so that takes up most of the TEF. And like I may have pointed out, you may have seen, TDEE is the total daily energy expenditure. So again, that's the total daily calories that your body is using to do the activities throughout the day. So to discuss how metabolism and weight loss are sort of intertwined, if you will, let's start out with, well, how do we lose weight? We do need a calorie deficit. So as I was talking earlier about your TDEE, if your body requires if your body requires 2,000 calories to function and exist with what you're doing right now, then you need to be eating lower than that. So eating fewer calories than your body uses in order to help with the weight loss process. And the nice thing about GLP-1 medications is for many people, it can really be helpful in maintaining that calorie deficit. Because one of the biggest complaints and one of the biggest frustrations when people are working toward losing weight is that calorie cutting can cause quite a bit of a heightened appetite, because that desire to eat is still there sometimes, and those cravings don't necessarily disappear. But the GLP-1 medications tend to help many people in this specific spot. So now we've got that deficit, we're working on our weight, and our weight is decreasing. But as our weight decreases, our metabolic rate also decreases. And this is expected to a point. And there is sometimes that question of why. And one way to think about it is there is less weight to move around. Imagine a car or a truck towing a trailer that is loaded down with weight. That requires a lot more effort on the vehicle's part, might have to burn more gas. The gas efficiency is not quite as high. Then the trailer is emptied, or it falls off, maybe on the road. Suddenly, you're not having to use as much gas. And so in a similar fashion, our bodies have less weight mass to move and less to maintain. So we're not going to require as high of a metabolism to simply exist. And also there is some muscle loss, which can be expected, but that is one of the things that we try to prevent as much as possible. So we don't want to over lose muscle mass, but there will be some. So again, that is to be expected. And so then again, we might find ourselves asking, well, then what's really the difference between a calorie deficit and under eating? If we're still lowering our metabolic rate, isn't that what we're talking about, this metabolic mayhem? So let's see what maybe some of the key differences are. And so I divided this up as calorie restriction versus under eating. And I really enjoyed reading this journal article down here that I reference at the bottom, because it talks about calorie restriction and its effects on aging, because there does seem to be some potential benefits in aging and longevity with a certain degree of calorie restriction. And so in their review, they touched on this, and I think this is a good general overview to see what the difference can be. Calorie restriction still allows you to get in enough nutrients, both macronutrients, so carbohydrates, protein, fat, and micronutrients, so your vitamins and minerals, without having a huge detriment in that, or with, you don't want to be lacking in any of those. You're still going to get some variety in your diet. And ultimately, calorie restriction does show beneficial outcomes for people in aging and overall health. And so it seems like, especially with the review of some of the studies they were referencing, calorie restriction is somewhere around 10 to 30% of a calorie decrease. Now let's talk about under eating, or maybe under feeding. There are many different ways to put this. One of the studies that they referenced was called the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, which was pretty dramatic. It was in the 1940s, conducted here in Minnesota, and I think it was investigating especially times during war and seeing the effects of essentially starvation on the human body. And so the calories were restricted by about 40% or more. And when we start to reach that point, the dietary quality, without question, is going to be reduced, because it's very hard to get in such few calories and still feel like you're getting in enough nutrients and enough vitamins or minerals. And of course, there are multivitamins and there are supplements out there, but that's not quite the same, right? The supplements can be a helpful tool, but they're not going to be a panacea, and they're certainly not going to overcome such a large detriment. And of course, worse outcomes long term. And we'll talk about some of those worse outcomes next. So, talking about the negative impacts of undereating. Well, your muscle mass, even though it would be expected to decrease slightly, it can decrease much more dramatically if there's a large amount of undereating. And with that lower muscle mass, then we get to an even lower metabolism. And with that even lower metabolism, it can sometimes be a bit more difficult to maintain our weight. Also, people had reported with an undereating a much poorer mood. Also, energy levels were very, very low, and overall body weakness was evident for many people. And so I would say, not that this was stated, but I imagine most people would say they didn't feel like themselves. They have lost a massive amount of weight, but also feel like they can't really function like they would want to. And nutrient deficiencies were far more likely, and that is, of course, also a problematic situation to be really deficient. I know I mentioned that multivitamins are out there, and there are ways to address nutrient deficiencies to a point, but thinking that we can use these supplements as a band-aid to cure chronic undereating is not necessarily a healthy way to try and go about that. And there's no guarantee that it can fully address the full amount of nutrient deficiencies that you might be experiencing. At the very end here, I put starvation mode with some question marks because that is a phrase that some people might say or you might hear. And it seems that many people have multiple definitions of what this means, which is unfortunate because I think the common term that you might have heard when people say, well, you're not eating enough calories, which means you're in starvation mode. So you're not actually going to burn anything and your body's going to hold on to everything you eat. That's more or less, in my opinion, a myth that doesn't quite track. Now, is there an adjustment that our bodies might make if we're not eating a whole lot of calories? Absolutely. There is metabolic adaptation. There is an adjustment that can happen if we're not eating sufficient calories, but it's not to the level of where our body just simply stops losing weight. So just be aware that that term is one that I don't quite like because it's been a little bit freely used, where I think it's essentially lost its meaning in many ways. So let's talk about how to maintain that metabolism. And of course, if we're getting in enough nutrients, enough calories, but still at a deficit, that's the number one situation. That's what we want to go for because that also means adequate protein. Get that from food or from healthy supplements. I think protein supplements have its place, especially when we are calorie restricting. And that will help you maintain your muscle mass as well. Nutrient-dense foods, what I talk about there is you want to aim for variety. So if you have your plate of food and it was one size, say it was a 12-inch plate, get that variety, but put it on a 10-inch plate. You're still decreasing your calories, but you're still also getting in plenty of nutrient-dense, high-quality calories. And exercise, especially strength training, as appropriate as you can tolerate, will be very, very beneficial as well, because we want to do the exercise to help maintain that metabolism, maintain that energy burn, and also maintain our muscle mass as much as possible. So to summarize, remember that calorie restriction and undereating, they are not the same. There are some big differences to them because you can still be healthy, lose weight while calorie restricting, whereas undereating, sure, you're going to lose weight, but at what cost to your health? And remember, appetite suppression is useful, but that doesn't mean that you cannot eat. You still have to eat, and it's still very important to eat healthily. Like I said, muscle mass preservation is key because muscles do equal metabolism, and that is one area where we have quite a bit of control. And while we're focusing on lower calories, fewer calories, just make sure that you're getting in balance, getting in variety. And then for you yourself, it's very important to monitor your progress because maybe you have concerns, I'm under eating, or maybe you feel like you don't have enough of a calorie deficit. Getting those regular follow-ups with your provider or the staff at Premier Weight Loss, getting on an InBody or other type of scale that can help measure our body composition to make sure we're maintaining muscle as much as possible. Those are going to be very helpful to make sure that you're still staying healthy while working on your weight loss journey. And with that, it looks like I didn't put a question thing at the very end here, but now is the chance to ask any questions if you have them. And I'll wait just a few minutes, but by all means, feel free to touch the little button at the bottom left hand of your screen if you have any questions about this, or if you think of a question later or would prefer to ask offline, you can always send a message to the Premier Weight Loss staff and they can get in touch with me. I'd be happy to address that question for you. So I'll just wait for a few minutes in case anyone wants to type something in. Right, I'll wait about 1 more minute. Let's see here. Hi, Maria. The question was, what about fasting diets? That's a really good question. So I'm going to assume that we're basing it off of intermittent fasting. So when there is maybe a 14-hour or more amount of time between eating, or some people will even fast where they might go a day at sometimes more popular is maybe eating 500 calories that day and then eating a higher level of calories the next day. And so that is a calorie restriction, and sometimes it can seem very dramatic, especially on those days where that might be very restricted, or some people might do a multi-day fast where it's very, very restricted. I would recommend exercising caution if you are taking a GLP-1 medication and fasting for extended periods of time, because that might start to flirt with overly restricting calories for a bit too long. Now, 1 or 2 days, I don't think that's going to be what breaks the proverbial bank, if you will. But fasting diets, those do operate under the idea of restricting calories. It's just sort of putting fences around that. There is also a component of ketosis that can develop if you fast for long enough. And so all of those things can fit in with still getting in enough variety and enough calories, but it's just still restricting it, but in a different way. That being said, on multi-day fasts, when it's 500 calories a day and less, those can sometimes make me a little more nervous in terms of the length of time. It doesn't mean it can't be done. I wouldn't say that a week-long 500-calorie fast, while people might notice a dramatic change in weight after a week, much of it actually can have to do with water weight, because glycogen in our muscles will be sort of depleted at that point, and glycogen does hold on to a bit of water weight. So people may notice a dramatic weight loss, but then also a dramatic weight regain once they go eating, quote unquote, back to normal. So I wouldn't say that it's necessarily under eating chronically when we're talking about a fasting diet, but just like any other diet, there are extremes that people can take that then veer it into the unhealthy. I hope that that addressed your question. If not, feel free to ask for clarification, or feel free to let the staff know. Very helpful. Okay, I'm glad. I just wanted to make sure, because again, fasting can go so many different ways, so I wanted to make sure to help. I appreciate your questions, absolutely. And let's see here. Again, I'll just wait just a minute or two in case anyone else has a question or something else comes up. Okay. I think I will wait for 1 more minute. Don't let me rush anyone. I think that will conclude tonight's discussion. Thank you for joining me. I hope you found it informative. Again, it's a very interesting area and always being researched. And I hope to see you next week or another one of my presentations in the future. As always, if you have any questions that weren't answered here or you think later, by all means, reach out to the Premier Weight Loss staff and they will get you in touch with me, or they also have quite a bit of a knowledge base and experience and they may be able to help answer it as well. Have a lovely evening and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.